I know that Judd knows it's great, but he's not at Chicago, so I feel I can spend a little bit of time talking about how good the paper is and how much I like it. Like all of Judd's work, this piece is thoroughly researched, carefully argued, and makes a genuine effort to situate us in the historical thought of the people at the time he is considering. And I think it makes a really important contribution to our understanding of legal thought during the early portion of the 19th century, and more particularly some of the early thoughts surrounding the Privileges and Immunities Clause of Article 4 and the very closely worded Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment. I was looking for things critical to say about the paper, and I think my comments are going to focus more on implications that might flow from the paper or be drawn from the paper rather than attacks at the paper itself, because again, I think it is a really, really good and really important contribution as it stands right now. So one set of questions I have is about the nature and content of these general citizenship rights. Judd mentions some examples in the paper. He mentions things like the right to own property, the right to contract, as well as what he calls axiomatic common law and natural rights like due process, habeas, speech, and locomotion. I'd like to hear a little bit more about those rights and their relationship to citizenship as such. And I think in thinking through that problem, I have in mind kind of two reference groups. One are people who are unquestionably citizens, who everyone acknowledges to be citizens, who enjoy rights in a somewhat more qualified way or limited way, principally white women, particularly married women, and minor children, who were denied full contract rights, limited in their property rights, and had their rights limited in some other particular kinds of ways. I think it would be helpful to consider more deeply. Judd mentions these categories in a few places, but it would really help me pin down the idea to understand their condition in relationship to the concept of citizenship rights as such. The other category of individuals I'm interested in are lawfully present aliens who are not in a state of hostility, people who are at war with, because they too enjoyed some limited natural rights and some rights of protection by the sovereign. So things like due process, locomotion, maybe habeas, and I'm a little less certain about speech rights, but I'd like to hear more about those kinds of rights as well, to really pin down what was considered a right of general citizenship as such. Earlier today, I think John Harrison expressed maybe some skepticism as to whether anything was actually in that category. I can think of one thing, but it might be the only thing that I can think of, at least from my own reading and own knowledge, the right of a non-resident to own land within the jurisdiction of another state. This was something that was denied to aliens typically, but something that even minor children and women could do. But I would be interested if there's anything else that attaches to the status of citizenship as such. So maybe we can define this as a negative category. Maybe there are things that are not part of general citizenship. I think the principal example discussed in the paper relates to the rights of voting and the elective franchise, but I think even that example is complicated because, as Judd mentions in the paper, at various times some people did think about voting rights in this way. Particularly prominent example, Corefield versus Choreo, the case that is often cited as emblematic of what privileges and immunities consisted of in the time, mentioned the elective franchise as regulated and established by the laws or constitutions of the state as among the general heads of rights into which privileges and immunities of citizens could be classed. In addition to these questions about the content of rights, I also have some lingering questions about the way in which these general citizenship rights were conceptualized during the pre-14th Amendment period. And it flows largely from the fact that this concept was almost always filtered through the provisions of Article 4. So the picture Judd paints of this relationship is as the body of privileges and immunities being a general mass enjoyed in relation to one's status as a citizen of a state that also had a connection to the status of a national citizen of the United States government. But I wonder if a different way of thinking about the same relationship might ground them more distinctively in the US Constitution itself. Judd traces this idea back to the common law rights of Englishmen, but these rights existed by virtue of a political relationship that the subject owed to the king. Those political relationships were, of course, severed with the break from Great Britain. So maybe the right way to think about this general citizenship is something that's conferred by the Constitution when Article 4 is enacted. In fact, this is how Justice Story talks about general citizenship in his 1833 constitutional treatise. General citizenship is conferred by Article 4. It's the purpose of that provision to restore this general citizenship among the states. Now, why does this matter? In the early 19th century, maybe it didn't that much. Courts probably didn't have that much occasion to think through carefully the precise conceptual relationship. It becomes much more important during the Reconstruction period, and it relates to some of these debates that Judd flags between the federative nature of the rights at issue versus the more nationalistic conception. But if we think of general citizenship as something derived from Article 4, maybe then we think of the rights of general citizenship as a subset of national rights. Now, I admit that maybe some members of the 39th Congress had a different view, but absent further evidence, I'm not sure exactly how widely shared or accepted those views may have been at the time of the 14th Amendment. Another claim in the paper is that these rights were substantive in nature, not merely anti-discrimination norms, but again, because they're filtered through the lens of Article 4, which is a non-discrimination provision, almost most people discussing it agreed at the time, I think it's a little less clear whether that is a universally shared conception or not. Again, it is reflective of some statements during the ratification period and during the debates in the 39th Congress, but I don't have a strong grounding as to whether or not that is entirely the case. Just another kind of counterexample possibly comes from Justice Curtis in his dissenting opinion in Dred Scott versus Sanford, says that the Article 4 does not confer on the citizens of one state in all states specific and enumerated privileges and immunities. They are entitled to such as belong to citizenship, but not such as belong to particular citizenships, and that it rests with the states themselves so to frame their constitutions and laws as to not attach a particular privilege or immunity to mere naked citizenship. So essentially, it's up to the states. States can decide what rights their citizens have, and it only comes into play when a discrimination or distinction is made. And just a final kind of general reservation about some of these discussions of citizenship during the Reconstruction period and the reliability of some of the statements made during those debates relates to some ideas that have already been kind of put out in earlier statements today, which is the strategic nature of communication during those debates. And I think that strategic communication attached to citizenship particularly as a major contested concept. This was a point on which you saw a sharp turn of political rhetoric during the period immediately surrounding the 14th Amendment's enactment. During the period leading up to the 14th Amendment's adoption, the strongest egalitarian and substantive conceptions of citizenship were voiced by opponents of the 14th Amendment. People who said, if you adopt this, if you make these people citizens, you're going to have to provide full equality to everybody, including African Americans, and therefore we'll have to eliminate segregation, allow interracial marriage, this putative parade of horribles that they were imagining. Those in support of black citizenship tended to take a much narrower conception of citizenship, denied that some of these results would follow as a result of that adoption. After the 14th Amendment's adoption, you see that rhetoric flip almost immediately. It is the opponents of black equality who are now arguing for the narrow conception of citizenship, and the supporters in the radical Reconstruction who are arguing most strenuously in favor of full citizenship-based equality. So I wonder how much weight or emphasis we can place on these kinds of statements as reliable guides to the more general understanding of citizenship at that time. So again, these are questions that go to the implications that flow from Judd's research and how much weight we should place on these conceptual categories as reliable indicators of the original understanding of the 14th Amendment particularly. But again, Judd's paper is an important contribution and I think can help us understand at least some of what's going on in the Reconstruction period more clearly than we could absent these contributions. So again, great paper, very much enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Do you have anything to say in response, Judge?
Sure, yeah, thanks so much. So I wrote this paper and added a couple sentences in about what the rights were. I realized that I hadn't said anything about what the content of the rights are. I've done a lot of that in my other work, but I haven't done the work necessary to say things about that in the 1860s and 70s. I want to be careful about not making claims I can't defend. I do want to say a couple things about the specific questions Ryan asked. So in terms of women and children, I mean, I think that there are a couple things going on here. One is there's an overlay of family law that's structuring the way people are thinking about the exercise of the rights. There's also an overlay of what we might call natural law or sort of common law limits on the rights of as they're actually regulated and exercised that's very much laid out in the concurring opinion in Bradwell, right? So that's not about common law rights, but you see this reflection that, like, in the nature of things and in the nature of the history of our traditions, there are differences among the sexes, et cetera. And so as long as that is doing work, you're going to see some pretty big differences. Lawfully present aliens, I think this is going to come from international law, sort of the treatment of them. But I do want to say something here that I think may clarify sort of where I'm coming from, which is I want to say, and I don't defend this in the paper, but I think it's right, equal protection and due process are rights of citizenship. So we shouldn't be thinking about personhood rights and citizenship rights as different categories. So it's a matter of some citizenship rights are extended to non-citizens, namely equal protection and due process. But I think that does some important work here. In terms of general citizenship rights being conferred by Article 4, I definitely agree with that. I just want to say that the underlying rights are generally understood to be not the product of Article 4 itself, except insofar as we're dealing with out-of-staters. Curtis is a little tricky for me. I don't think he's articulating a view that's consistent with what I'm saying. And that's okay with me because I'm not trying to claim everybody was saying this. I'm trying to claim there are a set of conceptual ways of thinking about this problem. But Curtis's is definitely not within the fundamental rights camp, so I agree with that. I don't think that Curtis is reflective, here I'm relying entirely on David Upham's paper, of the way people are generally thinking about this in the 1860s, so I'm not particularly uncomfortable about that. But I think it's a nice point. There is a limited sense, though, in which Curtis is right, which is that there are rights of interstate relocation that trigger a general right of non-discrimination with respect to all rights. And then the last thing I want to say, so I like the point that Ryan was making at the end. The thing that I want to say here is, first, that very well might be right. And second, it very well might be right that the disputation about citizenship rights in the 14th Amendment context is transforming ways that people are thinking about citizenship itself, not only, so I agree with Ryan's point, not only because there's this highly salient political debate happening, but also because the underlying support system conceptually for general citizenship is eroding in the late 1860s and early 1870s. So the critical debates that shape the way that people like Salmon Chase were thinking about this are no longer in play. Like, we're not debating the Fugitive Slave Clause anymore in the late 1860s. And so the underlying framework that I'm talking about, I think, is changing as a result of that. Thanks.